Did you have a preference on where we started?
So, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with what we were negotiating on 21-25 and get all the kinks worked out in there. I think that's the biggest one in front of us.
I believe so. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, to work through, do we want to tackle the protest petition versus election? Is that kind of where we want to get started?
That would be great. I did have a little bit of a chance, not a long time, to visit. I was really glad when Senator Corson brought up, and then you agreed that you like the idea of an election over a petition. And so it got me to thinking, we did have that language in that was repealed in 21. We're not going back to the exact same thing, but the mechanism for the trigger would be different. It would be based off of your language for the trigger, but it does have the mechanism for an election process.
Right, and I actually pulled up that old statute, 79-2925C, and looked at that, and it does allow for either the primary, the general, a mail-in ballot, or a special election. There aren't really any dates that I saw in that old statute.
No, and after visiting with Amelia, we can write an exception for this area to negate the 45 days or decrease the 45 days, whichever you would deem fit. And, we need to decide primary, general, mail, ballot, special election, where everybody's comfortable with on that. But I do like the idea of it.
And this was a conversation I had with Representative Sawyer, going back to his experience that he's had with the prior tax lids in the 80s and such. And if I misspeak, you can correct me here, but it sounded like they had things scheduled for the primary election on the former tax lid from the 80s. So whatever the taxing subdivision would be, would have to notify, not necessarily, they wouldn't have to have their budget adopted, they would just have to say, we are going to exceed, I think it was just kind of was there a threshold back then of inflation, or was it just exceed the amount of taxes that they levied the prior year?
There was a threshold that was based on new construction. New construction was one of the pieces. There were different pieces in it.
Okay.
It wasn't an inflation factor, but you had a lid amount. If you wanted to exceed that, you had to do a super vote, charter resolution or charter ordinance if you're a city, subject to protest petition. And you had to do it early enough so that you could have your election by the primary so that the budgets could still be certified by August 25th.
Okay. I was just curious if we put parameters in there that said if you're a taxing entity that intends on exceeding this threshold that we've got in place right now, I guess I shouldn't say right now because we haven't agreed exactly what that threshold is going to be, but if they intend on exceeding the threshold, they don't necessarily have to state how much they intend to exceed it by, but it would be subject to that primary election. Now, we have guaranteed primary elections every 2 years in Kansas. If you're from small communities like mine, you don't have enough candidates on the ballot in the city school election years to actually have a competitive primary election. So in that case, we would have to actually have an election they wouldn't necessarily have in some communities. That might be the situation where the state would have to reimburse for the cost of that election. I don't want to put more expense back on the local governments, but if we did something like that, it could, every other year at least, it would be, I don't know if you call it a free election, but essentially it would be on an election that we were already having at that time, so it wouldn't be any additional cost. It wouldn't be trying to insert another election in between the primary and the general. I kind of like that idea in theory.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that Representative Sawyer has that experience and background. I know they talk about term limits, but sometimes that institutional knowledge is beneficial. So I think it would be worth pulling that language out and taking a look at it this evening. I really do like that idea. I think I'm not hearing any objection from the other conferees. It makes sense. I would like Senator Corson.
Just gonna make a quick comment. I don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I do think we should really go down this path, and I do think we should look at it. I would just make the observation that if somebody is trying to decide whether or not they want to sign the petition, they might be interested in knowing exactly how much the municipality or taxing entity plans on exceeding the whatever the formula is, revenue plus inflation, blah, blah, blah. You know, they might want to know, is it a penny over? Is it $1 over? Is it 15% over? And that may determine whether or not somebody wants to sign the petition. That's kind of my thoughts. I want to throw that out there for consideration.
Well, thank you. There wouldn't be no petition with this method because it's a threshold that goes straight to an election. So I really like that idea. It's been implemented before. I think we need to figure out, so we will look at that language and head down that path. We need to figure out what the trigger is, and maybe looking at the old language would help. Also, considering what you had put together, or a combination of. But I think what went wrong with the last lid was just too many exceptions, and they were always going to the top of the lid. What? Oh, go ahead. No.
When I did pull up the old language, the old statute, it was surprising how many exclusions, exemptions were on that. The tax lid of 2015 actually had a 5-year average of the CPI. I'm not sure if that's something that would be a little bit better. It does, you know, taking an average, it does kind of alleviate the volatility that we sometimes see in inflation. I did a 25-year analysis on that. And the highest would be, obviously, these last few years with 2022 was 8%, 2023 was 3.8. Just last year, we would have seen an average of over 4%. It would have been 4.12, but nothing really got, using an average, it didn't really get high. But then you also, because there's sometimes that inflation is actually negative. It's not very often, but it does happen, and that also does eliminate the possibility. Well, I guess it doesn't eliminate. You could have 5 years of negative inflation, but that's extremely unlikely. But it would allow that from going below zero, would provide a little bit more stability for local governments.
Yeah, we usually pay a price after those negative inflation years, deflation. But Mr. Chairman, let's take a look at that on the triggers. I know we're going to break again, so we'll consider that language. And I would also like you to consider, one of the things with this is if a governing body, and this would just be municipalities and counties still, we're not including any other taxing authority, right, on the trigger, or is it a trigger for, we need to figure that out too.
I think the way the House position was, it was every single taxing authority. If we wanted it to limit it just to cities and counties.
No, I think we'll keep it every. It's just the Astra money was only.
Yes, the Astra is limited to cities and counties.
Okay.
The House position did not apply to school districts or the state as well.
Correct.
I think they need to be included, including the state, but we can visit about that. So what I was wondering is for the counties and municipalities, if I don't want to reward, if they decide they're going to go ahead and they lose their election, they should not qualify for the fund. But if, that's all I would ask, that if they keep under, then absolutely they qualify for the fund. But if they go to an election and win, then they get the extra money. The fund doesn't come into play. But if they lose that election, I don't think they should be rewarded for going to the election.
Okay, we'll take that under consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, I wanted to ask about that October 1st date. If we're going to use the October 1st, rather, I assume we're just completely getting rid of that August 25th date. Everything is now October 1st. I didn't know if staff had a chance to do any research. Can a county clerk automatically administer a prior mill levy if it's not been adopted by the local board?
Let's leave that question. I mean, can we have them answer it when we come back so that they can research it? I just don't want to ask them on the spot, if that's okay.
Right, well, I'd asked the question the last meeting.
Oh, you had,
if
yes.
they had a chance to look at it. If they hadn't, then that's fine.
We have not had a chance to look
Okay.
at that yet, sorry.
Understand.
That'll be good to know whether we address that or not, yeah. And Mr. Chairman, so the Vice Chairman and I were discussing the Astra Fund increases 2% each year. And one of the mechanisms is it goes back to the State General Fund. I'm wondering if we should keep that money available for the next year so that instead of sending it back and forth, that, you know, that if it's not used, then there would be a portion of it, so the State General Fund wouldn't have to come up with as much money that year. I'm just trying to use out of it with some, you guys can see where I'm going with this.
Yes, certainly, and I'd be absolutely willing to entertain that position, because that was just, I was trying to clean up the accounting a little bit, and we've had some other statutory provisions where if it's unused, that money gets put back into SGF, but you're exactly right. That means there's a larger proportion that needs to be allocated or appropriated the next year. So I would certainly be willing to accept that position.
Thank you, because I think then we would have the initial 60 million and then the 2% increase each year, and then it would be the difference of what was handed out. We wouldn't be coming up with that total 60 million each year. That's just what I was trying to make this work, because we want the funds in there. That is the incentive, an incentive. So I think that might make the program be even more effective.
I would agree.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm curious on the $60 million figure, where did that come from? In other words, I could pick any number, but I thought you probably had a reason for it.
I did when I was visiting with our appropriations chair and the speaker way back in August and September, when I was working through how much money they felt as the kind of the budget experts they were willing to sustain and put into the budget for tax cuts. They told me $60 million, and that's literally where that number came from. They thought we could put $60 million toward tax cuts, so that's the number I put in there. I would have liked for it to be much higher, but I also would have liked to have the 1.5 mils gone from the state. I would have liked to reduce the 20 mil levy down to 18.5. All total, that was probably going to be about $200 million of property tax relief, which I was in favor of, but I got vetoed, so.
If the 60 is not sufficient, or I know it's on some kind of a formula, but some years it might be 40 million, some years it might be a different amount. If the local units of government would be entitled to more than a total of 60 million, is it based off of a percentage? How do we determine who gets what amount if 60 million is not enough for everyone?
and I might turn to the revisers, but the intent is that whatever is appropriated, like this year, as we're building our budget, if we appropriate money into that fund, whatever that total of money is, that's when the state treasurer will make the calculations on how much each county and city is eligible for. But if I'm misspeaking, I might look to the revisers to correct that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Essentially, the 60 million it gets divided between 105 pots, and then out of the 105 pots, for each county, that amount possibly could go towards the cities and the counties that are located in the county. And any city or county not eligible would get returned essentially back to the state. So I don't know if that clarifies it or not. But that 60 million and additional amounts thereafter with 2%, it would never exceed that amount.
That's not really what I'm asking. If we have a really good group of counties and cities that hold their tax revenue down, we are incentivizing them to hold it down by the state giving them money. If we have a lot that hold the spending down, the tax collections down, and we need more than 60 million, what's the formula to say, okay, sorry, you're not getting the percentages? Is that strictly up to the state treasurer to determine?
Oh, no, the 60 million, it can't ever exceed whatever's been appropriated to the
I
fund.
understand that.
Okay.
But if, I'm apparently not asking my question clearly. If we needed more than 60 because every county was holding it down, or is it just 60 and then it's just divided up?
Yes, it's $60 million, and then they just divide it up.
So if we have only 10 counties and cities, then would they be entitled to?
They only get what they're qualified for. The state treasurer makes the calculation, let's say it's the $60 million. They make a calculation based on every single county and city qualifying.
Okay.
So once that number is determined, I might defer to the revisor so I don't confuse.
So let's just start with the first year. $60 million does not deal with the 2% adjustment yet. 60 million is the amount that would be apportioned to the 105 counties, and then there would be an allocation calculated to each county and each city in the county. That's for the calculation happens for all of those. Whether or not they actually get their allocated portion of that 60 million depends on whether or not they meet the qualifications. So those that meet the qualifications would get their allocation. Those that don't meet the qualifications, their allocation currently under the language would go back to the state general fund.
Thank you.
So is there a fund created for this? That it's the Astra Fund. Okay, I just want to make sure, so we wouldn't have to send it back to the state general fund. Okay, okay, great. And, okay. Is there any more questions on that? Seeing none, okay. I think we have a good understanding of that. We're going to take a look at the primary language from the 80s and then consider the amount if they went to an election and lost, that they don't get it. Then we need to define the triggers, and we're going to look at what was in the 80s and a combination of what you have put together and what the Senate passed out of tax committee. We didn't pass anything across the floor.
I do want to make it clear, back in the 80s, it was a protest petition that called for an election.
We don't want to do that.
Yeah, I would try to get rid of the protest petition and just go directly to an election where the local boards would have to notify the clerk that they did intend on exceeding the threshold, and it would go directly on that primary ballot.
Yeah, so we just need to define the threshold. Okay, and then is there anything else on that portion of it, the logistics of it, and then the October 1st question?
Yes, that's all the notes I had.
Okay. And there anything else that we're missing on the logistics of that? And then the revenue neutral changes to the letter, what you would like to see added, the difference on that. Are you okay with paying for the 2 years?
I think for the start of this, it would be a good faith effort on our part as the legislature to do that, but that's also part of the idea of the ASTRA fund is to help with some of these unfunded or underfunded mandates to where potentially after 2 years, we could look at pulling that off and just let them, if they're receiving their money from the ASTRA fund, that could compensate them for the additional notification.
That makes sense. We just thought since we were changing the notices again, that we would help them out a little bit with that. The Senator Corson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just from my understanding, Representative Sawyer may know the answer to this. So would the question that would be going to a voter then is just, do you want to exceed whatever this threshold is, whatever threshold we decide? Do you want to exceed that, yes or no? There wouldn't be, again, any indication to voter by how much it would be, because we're so early in the budget process, we wouldn't really know that. So the question would just be, do you want to up or down? Do you want to exceed it by some undefined amount? Okay. All right, thank you.
So,
Yes, I think so.
okay. I was thinking about this, and I know we talked about possibly the 1.5 mil, repealing that, the state, and we've got this fiscal note with the ASTRA. After visiting with the Commerce Chairman, I think we actually have a pay for, and it's one of the bills that the House passed. It's a low income housing tax credit. We wouldn't have to do anything in this, but we just know that if that bill is repealed, the pay-fors are there, and we don't have to worry about such an impact to the budget.
Do you know where the status of that bill is right now? I know the House passed it. I did not think the Senate had a position on that.
But they're conferencing on it.
Okay, okay,
So I think we should keep that in mind.
okay.
If you want to break the 1.5 mil out, I think we've got enough vehicles this year and keep it separate from this, that's fine. Or if you want to put it in, you can take a look at it.
Again, just looking at the total fiscal impact, if it looks like we can manage that in the budget, I'm happy to entertain that, but I do want to make sure that I don't want to include it and then not get the other bill passed, so I would probably hold on that, but certainly I'm willing to put it into this vehicle if we want to do so. Madam Chair, if we would go back to the discussion on the revenue neutral notice form, I know when you and I had talked, you talked about including the mill levies, the mill levy rates on there. As I look through that form, you know, part of my reasoning for wanting to get rid of that form is just it's confusion. It's got a lot of really good information. If you're a tax nerd, you can understand it, but to the average taxpayer, I'm not sure if it's almost information overload. I would like to see some totals at the bottom of that revenue neutral notice. I'm not sure if we need to clarify that in statute, but I would suggest that adding the mill levies on there would almost be a little bit detrimental to just how busy that form is. People typically look at the dollar amounts and specifically the totals. I didn't know if you'd be willing to entertain that compromise.
Definitely the totals, we had put that on in an amendment in ours. It was in our House Bill 2396 that we kicked out of the committee. But what we found last year was we had pared the form back so much that people were having a difficult time understanding the different rates and the different mills. Let us take a look at that and see what we think. I don't want to come back next year, hopefully, and change it, but the sad thing is it should have never been in statute, but they fought us so hard on that first year that we felt compelled to put it in statute. So that's where we're at. But yeah, we'll take a look at it. We'll get copies again and take a closer look. We'll definitely agree the totals should be on there. I think you're right with that last table. That last column in that table needs to be revisited also. I think you might have some better information that could go on that table or remove it, that column anyway. And then, yeah, we can take a look at the rest of it too.
Right, and I guess if we're going to move to an election, we wouldn't need a lot of that information regarding the protest petition, but there are some ways to, I think, make it a little clearer to the taxpayers. The protest petition notification piece out of the House's Committee of the Whole version of Senate Bill 35. Sorry, that's a lot of information there, but we just required in that notification, the protest petition notification, that you'd have prior year's taxes levied, current year's taxes levied dollar amounts, and then just a simple, this is how much by dollar and by percentage, this is how much your taxes are either going up, staying the same, or going down. I felt it was a really simple way for taxpayers to see who's raising taxes, who's holding the line, and who's actually cutting taxes.
Yeah, I've never thought of myself as a tax nerd, but I may be one of those people that like to see more information than less, but we'll definitely take a look at it. And I think you're correct on the titles. Instead of rate, if we would add rate and then mill, so that they would know if that stays on, if it stays on. Because, yeah, I think we can clean it up. We'll take a look at that over the break. It's not going to be much of a break, is it? But, yeah, we'll take a good look at it.
Okay.
So.
And while we're still on that bill, is there anything, the Senate Bill 269, that Board of Tax Appeals fee, was there any question on what the House had done? We just included, I think, to specify that it was for the parcel. I think we could probably include that fairly easily.
I think that was a good addition. But yeah, we'll definitely, I don't think there was any questions or concerns over it. It just made it clearer that it was actually the property that you were contesting.
Okay.
Yeah. It's always nice to have a second set of eyes looking.
Is there anything else on that bill that we wanted to include? Did you have a preference on where we stuck some of the Senate Bill 10 provisions? Those would also be property tax provisions.
Would they be able to go into 2125? So I'm at 2125, 269, 35. And then
227.
Yeah, not 227, if you don't mind. I'd like to leave that out.
Okay.
Yeah. So it'd be the contents of Senate Bill 10 as the House version or the Senate version?
The House version.
Okay.
And if you wanted to put that in a different bill, that would be fine too. I didn't want to lose that one.
Well, I'm hoping we get this bill passed too. So let's take a look at it, but I think that's good to put Senate Bill 10 in there. Did you guys didn't pass that across the House floor, did you?
We did not.
Okay, it passed the Senate 37-3. So So we have a pretty strong position on it, but yeah, I definitely understand what you guys did with it, and we'd be willing to accept that language. But,
Unless you feel like it's making this bill too large. If we need to pull back on it and put it somewhere else.
let's take a look at it over the break, but I don't know. I really would like to do the 1.5 mil, and it doesn't, I don't know what, do you want it in this legislation with the 21, 25, or would you rather see it alone? And we don't have to decide now, we can come back, but I wish, would you think about that? And then would you consider, I know we talked a little bit about 2231. We do have quite a few senators that would like to see something done on that, but, and I know that you have a couple other provisions down below, maybe. You can take a look and see what, if you'd like to couple something with that to maybe sweeten the deal. But if not, I understand. Yeah.
Okay, so on 2231, that would be, the personal exemption would be income. The tax freeze program technically is property tax, but it is an income tax provision that goes into that. So yeah, why don't we take a look at that and see where we can go with that.
Okay, and then the only other thing on my list is 5011. We did do the motion to accede on that. You want to visit about that when we get back?
We can go ahead and start the conversation now on 5011.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I know we appreciate what you guys sent us. We took a look at it. I know the House worked on it. The Senate, we're pretty solid. In fact, we picked up 2 votes. That could be debated as to why, but, and it was a bipartisan vote. So we're hoping you'll consider the 3% limit and then the provisions that were in the Senate version of 5011.
Did anything change versus 5011 versus 1603 as it passed across the Senate floor?
No, we were afraid to change a word or a comma.
Okay.
We made it exactly the same.
Okay. I'm not sure if staff would be prepared for that. Would you mind just reviewing what currently is in 5011?
Yeah, sure. The 5011 would propose and this is Senate sub for HCR 5011, would propose a constitutional amendment to be considered on the November 4th, 2025, a special election called in conjunction with the general election held on that date, a proposed constitutional amendment to apply to generally limit the growth of taxable value to any real property to 3% per year. The limit would not apply under 5 circumstances: new construction or improvements having been made to the property, the class or subclass of the property changing, the property becoming disqualified from exemption, the property being first listed as escaped or omitted, or the legal description of the property changing. However, in the event that the legal description changes by virtue of the combination of multiple parcels into a single one, then the 3% limitation would apply to the aggregate of the multiple parcels from the year before. The concurrent resolution that would specify in the proposal that the benefit would remain in place when title to the property is transferred or changed or conveyed to another person, unless the legislature enacts provisions providing for exceptions to that, that provision providing for it to be remain in place. And I think, oh, and then the other thing that is of course of note is that for tax year 2026, the limit would be generally applied the same, but it would be 3% relative to the 2022 appraised value of the property, unless one of those 5 exceptions applies.
Okay, so as I read this, it would not need a trailer bill to implement any of these changes. It would take effect, I assume this is on the November of 25 general election?
It is.
Okay. And is there any definition, Eddie, you mentioned new construction or new development. Is there any, would a simple, like adding on a porch or putting concrete for a driveway, would that impact the, would that immediately step it up to the current fair market value?
The provision, the concurrent resolution specifically provides for the legislature to be authorized to define new construction or improvements and enact other implementing legislation. It's just that those aren't actually required for it to be introduced, but it could be as defined by the legislature.
Okay, so if this passed on the ballot, that first year, tax year 26, I'm assuming they would have to just fall under that 3% cap, because anything we would pass probably wouldn't be until March or April on any definition. So they would just operate off the 3% cap from there?
So in the event of the legislature having not further defined new construction or improvements, the agency administering it, which I believe would in essence be the Property Valuation Division of the Department of Revenue, potentially the Board of Tax Appeals if this was appealed, would just administratively determine what constitutes new construction or improvements on kind of a case-by-case basis.
All right, it'd just have to be the status quo essentially of what they've been doing. Okay. The 3% applies to all classes of property?
Mr. Chair, it is all subclasses of real property and personal property in the mobile homes that are classified as personal property, but that would be the only personal property subclass.
Madam Chair, I think it's very reasonable to take consider your offer. We'll talk about that and be happy to work on what we can put together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. We've got a lot to think about. What time do you want to come back? Or is there anything else you want to go over?
I think at this time we've got quite a bit on our plate right now. Let's go ahead and see if we can get some answers on these and move forward. Then maybe we can clean up some of the other items. We do still have a couple of other shells out there if we want to put some other provisions in. I think we've got a pretty good path forward for now, though.
That sounds good, Mr. Chairman. I'm a saver, though. I hope we don't use them all for this year. We can save 1 or 2 for next year, but that's okay. If we need to use them, yeah, we need to use them. Yeah. What time do you think?
Do we want to give everybody a chance to go out and grab a bite to eat and come back?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, would 7:30 be enough time, or?
I'm going to defer to research and the reviser since they have more on their plate than most of us.
We'll plan on 7:30.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Testing, yep, okay. Madam Chair, welcome back. Did you hand this out? Do you want to go over this right quick, or where do you want to jump in at? I'm assuming we want to try to tackle 21, 25.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that would be great.
Okay.
And Eddie prepared this for us.
Yes, so this is a mock-up of the form reflecting the changes that are incorporated into 2125 as it passed the Senate. It has, as you'll notice, the columns in the kind of center section there that are shaded grayish. It does include kind of sub-columns for both of those, rate, with a rate and an amount. Under the form as it currently exists, it's only the amount. It also includes a line for totals at the bottom. And there are a variety of places anywhere where you see the word proposed. The current version, I believe, says maximum, and this says would replace that with proposed tax. I believe that captures kind of. Oh. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, the total is not actually in 2125. That version of it was from 2396 as amended by the Senate committee.
So, Mr. Chairman, if you wouldn't mind, if we firm up this sheet as to improvements, I know you had some suggestions, and I think the other conferees might have some also.
Certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the only other comment that I had, when I look at my revenue neutral notice, that bottom chart there where it details the public hearing notice, that 2020, that gray column on the far right there can be kind of confusing because that number is always different than the column above where it's the 2025 proposed tax exceeding 2024 tax. That column up above is the actual tax difference and tax increase that the taxpayers need to know. I understand what that calculation is down there in that second table, the gray column, but it's kind of confusing because that's compared to the revenue neutral rate, which sometimes doesn't always equal what the actual tax increase is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're all in agreement on this, that we could delete that box. Do you have an objection?
I think originally I thought, well, that'd be a great spot to put the protest petition notice, but if we're removing the protest petition, there really isn't any need for that column at all.
No, but if you wanted on that column, we could put, whether it wasn't on a previous election, if it was on an election ballot, but we don't need to muddy the water.
Yeah, they would be after the fact, so I wouldn't worry about that.
That's fine. So we did talk about the rate, deleting those columns on the three above. We've visited about it. We were hoping you wouldn't mind leaving those in. I know it's a little bit of data, probably more than most people want, but I think it helps to be able to do the math and the calculations. Yeah.
It does, and like I say, you and I both understand what that means. I just didn't know if that extra information would be a little bit too much for some people to try to compute and understand what that means. But would you want to leave that as rate, or do you want to call it mill levy? Do you think that
like your
matters a difference?
suggestion of somehow putting mill on there. I think mill might be, what do you, I'd leave it up to you guys. Senator Corson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do think when I talk to constituents, you're of course right, Mr. Chair, that most of them just do look at a dollar number, but to the extent they talk about anything, it typically is mill levy. I hear that more often than rate, I would say, is just kind of more common in my experience with constituents in my area at least.
When you testified in committee, it sparked a chord, and I started looking at the form, and I thought, you're absolutely correct. Mill levy makes more sense, or mill, than just calling it a rate.
Yeah, I think mill levy resonates with a lot more people. I mean, they're the exact same number, except the mill levy is the tax rate divided by 1,000, so. typically on your levy sheets that are a public document. People can get those at the county clerk's office. Those are all specified as mill levies, not tax rates, so that will just maintain some consistency.
It makes perfect sense. Any other suggestions or improvements on the form? I think this is going to make the form a lot better.
I agree. And did you have a chance to consider the House's proposal of actually putting the taxes so people could see what the tax increases are? This information is good for seeing, this is kind of an estimate of what their tax bill would be. Would you be amenable to including the tax information either on the back? I mean, this form's pretty busy right now. I didn't know if we could require a second page or have it be printed on the back.
We didn't know, but yes, we're receptive to that. I mean, I understand why you're trying to get that data in front of them. We wondered, I know we like the valuations on property values on there, but would it make sense to take that box off, or you like that on there?
I do, because that matches them up well with their tax statement when they get that, so they can see which parcels, if they have multiple parcels and if they have different properties. I think that information is valuable to have on the form still.
So I'm wondering, Eddie, could we kind of do a mock-up of maybe, I'm wondering if we need all of the, I don't know, if maybe the header could be smaller and stuff, and that we could take some of the language off, and maybe if we could get that on there, that information on there, or would that be too much? I would like to force it to be printed on the back, but I think, or maybe we could just leave it up to their discretion and just say that that information would be included, whether it's a second page or whether it's on the back.
You could include just direction that it be included in, and then leave that. That's certainly one option. The other thing, I don't know if this would make the columns too clunky, but you did delete a column in that lower section. I mean, you could have taxing entity proposed tax in kind of the aggregate down there, because I think that, I don't know if you could split that column. As you can see immediately above it, it's the same width of the column and it's split there. You could have a prior year and current year there as well, and that you might get some of that information.
Would that be helpful, or?
Any way we could fit that in there, I think would be fine. We probably don't, on that second chart at the bottom, the date and time for the public hearing, we could probably shrink that up a little bit and then add the prior year's tax, current year's proposed tax, and then the difference.
Would you mind putting a mock-up together for us?
I think I probably, so prior year tax, current year tax, and difference, in essence.
Yes.
And by tax there, you mean the total amount of tax levied by the entity that is listed in that specific subsection there. I can do that on the mock-up, I believe. The only thing I would note there, I don't know, it might be the case that the only entities listed there are those which are required to have the revenue neutral rate hearing. But that being said, that would just mean that you wouldn't show any of them that are zero or negative there. So, but you're showing all of them that are increases.
Right, and when I look at, and I'm not sure if all of them do this, but when I look at my revenue neutral notice, I have all of my entities listed, even the state, even though it's not subject to that. If we needed to require that all entities were listed there, if we needed to clarify that, I'm not sure if everybody else's notices look like mine, but.
I think the only possible limitation there is that I think that lower table is described specifically in the statute as providing information concerning the date, time, and location of the hearings. But if we just specify that they are to include the aggregate tax levy from the current year and the budget year and the difference, either the counties would put it in that spot or they would find another place on the form to do it. This just maybe provides them one place where they could do it.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into the weeds trying to
Right.
say where it needs to go and what font size it needs to be. If we just give them the directive, we can see what the Office of Accounts and Reports comes up with for the form. And if we need to make modifications or suggestions from there, we could.
That makes sense. I appreciate that, yeah.
Madam Chair, the reviser did make me aware of a situation, and this might come back also to the election language that we've got in here. With some of these changes, do we need to have because right now we have implementation of this year. If we're requiring some changes, do we need to postpone this a year?
So, Mr. Chairman, the revenue neutral rate letters, we did not change those until 2026. We were giving them a year to change them. Oh, no? Oh, I thought we did. Okay, because we did not want them to have to try to put that on the 2025 letter. So, yes, absolutely, that was our intent. So if that didn't happen, then we'll make sure it happens in conference committee. So, yes, we would just ask that these changes went in by 2026. Is that what you were thinking? That's
Yeah.
why we chose the 2-year pay for on the 25, 26, too. The revenue neutral rate letter? Yeah.
Okay. So we would not have any of the provisions effective for 26, the election or,
Now, that's up to you. If you want to try to implement those this year, that's fine.
okay.
Is it feasible?
One of the questions we were talking about is if we require, by June 15th, if we require a public board or taxing entity to notify the county clerk, if the statute isn't effective until July 1st, we've required them to do something retroactively on June 15th. Unless we would put it on publication in the register, it would take effect earlier. But I just didn't want to require them to do something on June 15th if the law wasn't in place until July 1st.
Right. Understandable, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to leave that up to your discretion. We don't, if you want to implement this year, that's fine. But if you don't, if you want to give a year to implement, you know, the problem, I guess, the more I think about this, though, when we gave a year or 2 years in prior lids, the locals went crazy, and we saw exorbitant property tax increases. And I got to tell you, I've been contacted by 2 different counties. The county appraiser, one of them is on record video stating that she increased the valuations 20% into anticipation of 1603 becoming law. And another clerk increased over 10% in their county. And same, so maybe we do, maybe we do not want to give a year. I don't know. If you think it's feasible to implement this year, maybe we do.
Perhaps on the changes for the form, could we delay those until next year? Because that will require some programming and with the software. I would like to put the election piece in place this year if we can, if we need to make it enforced or have it become law on publication in the register. That would speed that up a little bit to where we wouldn't be requiring something on June 15th if it's not law until the 1st of July.
Okay, so the form would, changes would not be until 2026, and we would still pay for 25 and 26 postage. And the election would take place in statute as printed in the journal, and then that would mean this year, 2025. Let me check, but I think we're fine with that.
My apologies. I was just double checking to make sure publication of the register would actually alleviate that problem, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And did you find out that it does?
Yes, that should be okay. There is a chance that that June 15th date, if that's what we choose, when we get to that provision, if there's a chance that that conflicts with any other dates in election law, we can address that at that time and maybe do a trailer bill later if necessary, but I'll save that conversation for when we talk about the date.
So we are going to accept your position on the register
Okay.
for this year, for 2025, for the Astra threshold portion, the election.
Okay, Madam Chair, looking, if we want to move on to that election piece, or is there any?
Well, I do, but I just want to make sure, confirm the dates. The December 1st mailing would be this year then also?
Yes, that's my
Okay.
intent.
And did we find out on the budget if they're not turned in by October 1st? Can the clerk revert back to the previous year's budget?
I would say on the surface of the provision that there's no glaring concern with it. The levies are by statute. This would be likely considered an exception to the other provisions governing the budget. Unless there's some specific concern that someone has, we could look into it, but it seems like it would be doable.
I would concur. When I had concern about that, we didn't have the statute that said if they hadn't turned their budget in, they could use last year. So that would have been an illegal levy. I think with the current language that we've got right now, my concern about that is alleviated. If we find down the road that we need further clarification, I think we can do that. But I'm okay. My concern with that, I'm fine with at this point.
Thank you. We were trying to help the clerks out in that, to get people to turn their budget in. So those provisions would also be in 2025 then too, the untimely budget and the October 1st budget deadline?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, and so the next would be the election piece and the threshold.
When I was visiting with the revisers on the election piece, the primary election is always going to be the first Tuesday in August. If we set a date of June 15th, the prior tax lid didn't have a date in there because it said the general, the primary, special election, mail ballot. It had lots of different options, so it didn't have a specific date. If we were going to define this only to the primary election, I think we need to give people notice that if you miss that date, not only are you not eligible to meet that cutoff, but we do probably need to add language that you cannot adopt a budget above what the threshold is. So by putting that June 15th date in there, I think that gives people clarity on what day they have to have that. And I'm not sure if we need to say on or before June 15th or how that language needs to read, but just make sure that people know that that is the 45-day minimum before the primary election to get those notices into the county clerk that they will be exceeding the threshold.
So, Mr. Chairman, we're fine with that. We just were wondering if that wouldn't be a hardship on the local governments to know whether they're going to exceed that threshold by June 15th, but you guys have more experience with local governments than we do, so we are going to trust your
They might not know exactly what their budget amount is, but by that point in the budgeting process, they should have a pretty good idea if they need to exceed it or if they're getting close to it. I think currently if they know that they're going to be exceeding revenue neutral, that date in law is July 25th, I believe. So it would be a month earlier than that. Typically, local governments, my experience was in county government. We were working on budgets actually starting in March and April. We usually had a pretty good idea of where we were going to be. We didn't always necessarily know what our final valuation numbers were going to be in June, but usually by June 1st, that time frame, we had a pretty good idea of where our budget was headed.
We're fine with that then, Mr. Chairman. So, June 15th is the deadline. Okay.
Did we also want to specify, there's some of these smaller counties don't have a primary every year. If we require them to have a primary only for this purpose, do we want to put a provision in that we would reimburse them for the expense of the election?
I don't think we want to encourage them to raise taxes. And like you said, if they're staying below, then they actually get part of the Astra fund. And we could revisit that in a year or two. Would that be feasible or?
Do we have, I remember the tax lid from 2015 said that cities and counties could allocate the cost of the election. Do we want to put something in there that the county government just has to pay for it? Or I want to avoid the situation where maybe a library district or something is the only one that exceeded that and caused the election, therefore they would have to pay for the entire election.
So we could do something like we do in the revenue neutral letter, that whomever participates in that election would pay a portion or pay proportionally for the election. With the letter, if you're exceeding revenue neutral, then you are obligated, even though the state's been picking up those funds. Yeah. I'm not sure what the fiscal note would be on paying for elections across the state. I'm just not real comfortable with that. And we are putting money in the Astra fund to help cover those types of expenses. I think if So, Mr. Chairman, is it less expensive to do a mail ballot election in those times? It's more expensive.
I honestly don't know. We had a mail ballot election when I was a county commissioner, and I can't remember what the price tag was on that.
I think we want to stick with an in-person, don't we? Yeah. Okay.
Probably so.
Maybe we could, I don't know. So, Mr. Chairman, the vice chairman just solved the problem. The county just has to find a couple of candidates to file, and there would always be an election. So, I mean, it sounds simple, but it's true. If there were anything on the ballot, then the county would be paying for it. So I don't know, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to lose this. I think it's really good work, so I'd like to figure something out.
Right, and I think the qualifier for requiring a primary is you have to have one more than 3 times the number of candidates available for a position. So if you had 3 positions for the school board, you would have to have 3 times that plus 1, so you'd have to have 10 candidates in that race to trigger the primary election. So we often do in small counties have just enough to fill the vacant seats, or maybe just a few more. But I'm with you. I don't want to get hung up on this piece to where we lose that.
Why don't the first year we just kind of let them pay for the election if they need one, and then we can revisit this next year, definitely, or increase the Astra fund as needed.
Okay. Would a compromise be on that? Because I know you said if they call for the election, they're not eligible for any of these funds. Would you be willing to maybe cut that in half or something, still allow them a little bit of the money because ultimately the county's probably going to be paying for this. If your township or your library district, they don't qualify for the Astra money anyway. So would that be a compromise, that maybe they would still be eligible for a portion, whether that's 25% or 50% of that fund? Well,
Mr. Chairman, we understand the desire to help. We're just afraid of the fiscal note without knowing, and we're not sure we can get that data this evening. And we're afraid if we pull from the Astra fund that it's lessening the incentive for the municipalities and the counties. Is that where you were thinking of the percentage coming from that? I mean, are we talking about paying for a fire district election? Yes, that's what I thought. Okay. So that would pull from the Astra fund?
well, it would make, and there's a little bit of a disconnect because some of those taxing subdivisions are eligible for the Astra money and some wouldn't be. So if you had a situation where your fire district and your township had an election, but the county and city did not, the county would qualify for the full Astra money, and they would basically be made whole for whatever the cost of the election would be theoretically. In the situation where you would have, let's say, a township and the county that were wanting to exceed the threshold, they both put the question on the ballot. If they still would receive, let's say the ballot measure failed and they were able to exceed that threshold, they wouldn't qualify for the money. At that point, they would still have to pay for the full amount, but you were proposing that if they had to go to election and it, well, I guess I shouldn't say it failed or succeeded, if it went to election and the increase was limited, they wouldn't qualify for any of their money, but under the Astra, if we could allow them a little bit of money to help pay for that election, I guess that's all I was trying to get at in that
So are you
situation.
thinking a percentage of the election then? What percentage would you say?
Well, I was just going to say, if they took it to election and they were restricted to maintaining their budget less than what the threshold is, under House bill, or under the House position, they would still qualify for the full Astra payment. If your proposal was that it disqualified from them from the 100% of the payment, if we just said that it qualified them for 20%, 25% of that payment or 50%, they would still get a little bit of money for kind of keeping taxes low, even though it was voter imposed, but that would kind of help them pay for that election.
Mr. Chairman, we really appreciate it, and we're thinking just to get us started, we think we're going to be back here revisiting this, but 25% for those that have an election that fails. Yes. But if the election, I shouldn't say fails either, sorry about that. If they cannot go above the threshold as a result of an election, they would receive 25% of the election. And then 75% would be on them to pay for it. Because we want them to have skin in the game for.
Well, I think my intent was that they only get 25% of their distribution from the Astra,
I
not
was only
25% of the
thinking 25.
election, so.
Let us revisit that then. I was thinking 25% of the cost of the election.
Okay,
So,
yeah, because I didn't know how to determine the cost of the election, and if that's where you're going, yeah, that could be an unknown fiscal note. We would know exactly how much 25% of their distribution would be, that they would be penalized. They essentially wouldn't get 75% of their distribution.
But if it's my understanding, the fire districts and others don't get any distribution.
Right.
Okay. So, okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to back us up a little bit so that we understand where we're at. In the election portion, only municipalities and counties, or in the petition, only election, it was only counties and municipalities, correct?
The protest petition?
Yeah.
The protest petition applied to all taxing subdivisions except schools in the state.
Okay. So that's where we're at on the election, too.
Correct.
Okay. So we're trying to figure out whether schools come in or not. And then we're trying to figure out if a county stays below the threshold and they're getting their Astra fund, and a fire district decides to go to the ballot. And well, either way, they don't receive any funds for the state for that election, and they're the only election.
Correct.
So the county would not be reimbursed for the fire district's ballot, is that?
That is correct. And my thinking here, and I apologize, it seems like we're getting really into the weeds here, but if a fire district was the only one that had enough candidates to call for an election, it's still on the county to pay for that election. They do not require the fire district to make up the difference for that election. The county is the one that holds the primary election, so if they're the ones that are calling for the election, if they're wanting to exceed the threshold, and they do end up being limited, they would only get 25% of their money. Everybody else would still qualify for their full payment if they needed it. But the county would still be essentially receiving their funding.
So I'm
The
sorry,
cities.
Mr. Chairman, so this county would get their full amount, but the fire district does not.
They do not qualify for any of it.
Okay.
When I said everybody else, I meant like any other cities
Okay.
within the county that still qualified. It doesn't reduce everybody's by 25%,
Okay.
or by 75%.
Okay. So the only ones that would be rewarded if they went on the ballot and it did not pass would be the counties and the municipalities. Everyone else would have to eat their own cost on the ballot.
Well, no, my intent is that we don't push any of those costs down to local entities at all. That's different than what the language is in the revenue neutral law, where it does, after the state ends their reimbursements, it does say that, they can split that cost up proportionately. My reasoning is that if your township or your fire district had an election and they're the only ones on the ballot, the county is still on the hook for that election cost. I wanted to treat this similar to where maybe the fire district and the library are the only ones that caused that election. I don't want them to be on the hook for that cost. I think the cost should still be held at the county level. But if the county isn't exceeding the threshold, they're getting their full payment from Astra.
Senator Corson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, we had a question. We just wanted to double confirm that under your proposal, or kind of what we've been discussing thus far, what we're envisioning is that only cities and counties would be eligible for Astra funds. Is that correct? We just wanted to double confirm that. Okay.
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And then if a county or municipality attempts to exceed the threshold and their election fails, you're suggesting that they keep 25% instead of ours was they don't get any of it. I understand.
Yes. And we could specify that it's just the county. If we're going to place the entire burden of the election on the county, that the county would be the only one that would be limited. I'd still be willing to go to 0 for the cities if they tried to exceed.
Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you getting in the weeds on this because I feel like we need to understand this. This is a big policy change and we appreciate it. We are going to accept that. I think it'll be a good start for the program. And like you said, we can revisit it if we need to. If we see a lot of bad behavior, we can just get rid of the 25%. But if, maybe something needs to change in order to, so yes, we're going to accept your position on that.
Do the revisers, are we clear? Is there any questions I could answer for what the intent is? Okay. Phew. Do we want to move on to the actual threshold calculation?
Yes.
Is there any?
I think we're good on that. If Amelia and Eddie, and Adam, do we have everything that you need?
Earlier there was discussion about a 4% alternate cap and also leaving out new construction. I'm not sure the two chambers had agreed as it relates to that. I did not have an agreement as it related to that in my notes.
Yes, I was just wondering if there was any other details that we needed to work out in the legislation before we got to the threshold, but.
Yeah, anything regarding the election piece?
Just to confirm, and I'm trying to find it in my notes as I ask it, you may not have reached agreement on this. One of the underlying provisions of Senate Sub for House Bill 2125 was an October 1st uniform budget deadline. Is that still the intent of, okay, all right.
Yes, that's my intent, Madam Chair. I guess I did have one final question on the election piece. Do we need to put language in there clarifying that if they do not notify the county clerk by June 15th, they are limited to the threshold? They cannot adopt a budget higher than what the threshold is that we decide? I can't remember if we discussed that already or not.
Did we? Okay. All right. Very good. I guess apparently we did.
I had that in my notes, and obviously when you get to a point, we'll recapitulate everything, but I think there's still a handful of things outstanding for you to continue on in.
Madam Chair, I think that was my intent. We need to make sure that's clear in statute that if they miss that June 15th deadline, they will be restricted to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had stated that earlier and we were fine with it.
So regarding the actual threshold, I think the Senate had made the offer to have it 4%, but not include new growth. Was there anything else that was part of that?
So, Mr. Chairman, we actually, what we passed out of committee was the CPI index, the Midwest CPI index, the one you had used, or 4%, whichever was lower, as the threshold that we passed out. Now, I understand, yeah, if you would take a look at that and consider that. Yeah, and we didn't pass 4%, we passed 3% with new construction. But when we were talking today, we thought it might simplify it. So we're just trying to make the equation as simple as possible so that it's easily understood and calculated.
Right, and I do appreciate that because that can get pretty complicated pretty quick if you add a lot of different factors into that. My only concern there is with some of the areas that are growing rapidly. Their tax base is expanding, their population is growing, they do have a higher requirement for providing services. Really would like to see that growth factor kept in there.
How about we did a compromise, Mr. Chairman?
Excellent.
So we did CPI Midwest Index plus new growth plus bonding. Or we did the 3% plus new growth plus bonding. So whichever was lower. If we took out the new growth, if we did CPI plus new growth and bonding, or 4%, whichever was lower.
Let us talk about that.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I apologize, it's late. Was the offer 4% or 3%?
We'll take 3.
Okay, I was thinking it was 4%.
Because we were trying to, I looked at Johnson County, their new growth last year, if the number's correct, was 1.2%. So we were at
okay.
3%. So we're just saying, what we're doing is probably guaranteeing that many of these counties are going to get right up to that threshold of 4% each year. And I would like to keep that as small as possible. That's why.
No, I agree, and I love tying that to inflation, and if it's 4% or less, I think that's a workable number. I was curious what some of the actual data was out of Johnson County and some of the more rapidly growing areas, so that helps put that into perspective a lot. Would you be interested in doing CPI and growth, but letting the voter-approved bonds kind of stand on their own and not be subject to that? I would just worry if.
So I guess maybe I didn't make myself clear on the offer. It was basically your language or 4%, whichever was lesser for that year. And you're asking if we would exclude the voter bond, and I think that would make sense in the 4% equation. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, yes, that was my question.
Could we go to 3% and exclude the bond?
I would feel a lot more comfortable at 4% until we actually get some data and see how some of these counties are coming in.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I don't have an idea of, this would only be bonds that had been voted on by the people. But
Unless you want to entertain all general obligation bonds, whether they're approved or not.
no, thank you. But my concern is, I guess we're going to be talking about, I think this might be feasible as a starting point. We would like to get it as low as possible. And so we were hoping 4% would be the maximum increase each year.
So that would include any voter-approved bonds, if there is increases due to
Yes,
that.
4% as a total is what we were trying to, that's why we were coming up from the 3 to the 4. We figured that would cover most of the new growth, not all, but for most counties, since Johnson was at 1.2 last year, that definitely. And then we're not trying to encourage bonding. We were afraid by excluding bonding, we're encouraging more debt, and we really don't want to do that.
Right.
So that's why we were looking at the 4%.
Yes. I think I'd go ahead and agree with that because, historically, as you know, tax lids always fail because we start adding more and more and more exclusions. We've got to try to keep this tight if we can. I think 4% is probably a reasonable number.
Okay. And then your equation, whichever one's lower, that'll be great, Mr. Chairman.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got the threshold. I think we've got the untimely budgets was in yours also, so that's been covered. We don't need a roll call vote since it's going on a ballot. I think we've, in the 20 mil then.
Right.
Okay. We're putting the 20 mil for school renewer.
It's just the standard 2-year renewal for the 20 mils. That piece.
I don't think we want to try to do anything to that equation this year. Do you, Mr. Chairman?
I would love to, and I would, but I think the hour is pretty late to be proposing that. Maybe we can take a look at it next year.
That sounds wonderful. do we include the BODA portion or 269?
Yeah, the House is okay with having that provision in there.
Okay, we will accept the House language on that.
Okay.
269. I think that's pretty hefty. Do you, Mr. Chairman? I think that's a pretty good lift.
I think so, but I think we've got a good product here.
I think it's a great product. I really am excited about it. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next bill. So we're in agreement on 2125, and did you guys want to go over the provisions on it, or am I speaking too soon, Mr. Chairman?
Does staff want a moment to kind of collect their notes, or?
The key thing, I think, before, other than just a general recap, is staff needed to clarify, were you including the elimination of the state 1.5 mil levies plus the replacement SGF transfers as a part of this agreement as well?
Madam Chair, would you be all right if we kept that in Senate Bill 35? We still have Senate Bill 35 hanging out there and not include it in this bill.
Thank you. The 1.5 mil, I think we definitely leave that in Senate Bill 35. Leave it alone, unless you want it in. You're okay with leaving it in 35, aren't you?
Yes, I think I'd prefer that. We do have that as a shell, and actually that was the original content of 35. So I think that's a good path forward, and I'd like to take action on that if it looks like we can.
That'd be wonderful. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are going to, as I stated when we first met, we're going to need an agree to disagree. And if we could do that tonight, I know we can't vote on it tonight, but we could start the paperwork so that we can run it first thing in the morning.
On which bill? Or which bills?
20, it's going to be bills, but 2125 to begin with.
Okay.
So far, we're good. Yeah. So 2125, did you want to?
So if 2125, that's a House bill, does the House run the agree to disagree first? Is that how that works?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, it would start on the opposite chamber. Since this is a House bill, it would start with the Senate and end in the House.
And we convene at 10, so I'm sure we'll run it first thing. 'Cause
Okay.
we would like to get these ran tomorrow, and I know you would too. Okay. So we'll probably meet at 10:30 or 10:50.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure what might be on the calendar for tomorrow in the House, but we could plan for 10:30 and,
Okay, that sounds great.
yes, please.
All right, everybody pay close attention, I guess I would say. So this would be in House Bill 2125. It would include all of the provisions of Senate sub for House Bill 2125 with the only changes being further revisions to the revenue neutral rate form as we discussed earlier, and all of the revisions to the revenue neutral rate form will take effect in 2026, not 2025. So that's the kind of starting point. If we're counting for bundling purposes, you might think of that as Bill 1. Just because it's a lot more straightforward, we'll start next the House version of SB 269. From there, moving up on the comparison sheet to House version of SB 35, we are not doing a protest petition piece of this, but we're doing an election requirement for exceeding the threshold. The threshold would be either it would be the lesser of the House version of the threshold from SB 35 or 4%. In the event of an election to exceed that, the election would have to be certified to the county clerk by June 15th. And if a taxing entity does not make that certification, they would not be allowed to adopt a budget in excess of that threshold amount. I don't think the roll call or anything else about untimely or notification really matters. So dropping down, the Astra Fund would continue to exist as presented with changes, and the changes would be that taxing entities would only receive payments from Astra Fund if they are below the threshold on their own accord, not by virtue of a failed election, with the exception of counties that have that try attempt to exceed it and have a failed election would receive 25% of their Astra allocation that they would have received if they stayed below the threshold on their own. We would not include the revenue neutral rate repeal, since we are doing some other things with the revenue neutral rate in this. We would include the 20 mil reauthorization for the same 2 years, just as passed in SB 35. Is that, I think that's everything that I have in my notes, but.
Representative Sawyer has a question.
I didn't, maybe you said this and I missed it, but I wrote down also, we made it clear that counties pay for the election regardless of who asked for it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I did not mention that, but yeah, they clarified that the election costs to be borne by the counties. Is there any other further questions, or did I miss anything? Oh, the effective date to be the Kansas Register in light of the June 15th date this year. That's it wouldn't be effective until after that June 15th date this year, unless it was in their register. So,
Mr. Chairman, one more thing. You had mentioned essentially where the unused funds would go. Currently under the bill, they go into the SGF, or were you wanting them to go back to the Astra Fund?
Yes, unused funds, I think it was the understanding that we would try to retain those funds as long as it's clear that the next year's appropriation doesn't have to be an additional $60 million. It would just be whatever is necessary to make the allocation for that fund. If there's $30 million, we don't need to put another 60 in there and make it 90 total. I just want it to be whatever that intended balance would be for that next year.
so the succeeding year transfer amount would be reduced by whatever is in the Astra Fund at the time.
Correct.
Thank you. I think that would be helpful, and that means the interest retained in that fund would help build up that fund too. So I think that's a good change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And lastly, Mr. Chairman, not included in this bill are most usual tax bills, but however, with the session getting late, we would need to include just the standard appropriation provision to spend money out of the fund. We can deposit money into the fund, but constitutionally under the budget laws, it would just require that, treasurer, can spend this amount, no limit fund. It's a pretty standard procedure you see in all budget bills, and next year it would get picked up in the budget bill. However, since there's probably not going to be a, last coming budget bill, for them to spend the money would need just the standard appropriation line.
Yes, if that'd be acceptable, I think we need to put whatever language necessary in there to.
In addition to that appropriation provision for the Astra Fund, it might be necessary for the revenue neutral rate notification costs fund as well. That would be within the Department of Revenue as opposed to Treasurer.
Speaking of the state treasurer's office, when we had the protest petition, we had kind of directed the state treasurer to send out the notification to the counties and cities on what their eligible payment would be. Do we want to retain that language, so at least the cities and counties wouldn't have to calculate that on their own. They would have all the information from PVD. Since the treasurer's office is the one making the disbursement, they were okay with making that notification to local governments on what their eligible payment is going to be with the parameters. Now, what would be the CPI and growth and voter-approved bonds, or 4%, whichever is less.
That was part of the Astra Fund provisions as it existed in SB 35, right? Yeah, so
So that's still continuing.
that would still be in there. The only changes to the Astra Fund as it would be SB 35 would be those that I specifically described.
We're just asking if there were any other provisions in the Astra Fund that we needed to discuss or be aware of.
Yeah, unless there's any questions.
I'm sorry?
Did you have any questions specifically on the Astra Fund, or?
No, I think we're fine.
Okay.
No. So I think we're good on that legislation on 2125. Mr. Chairman, yeah.
Madam Chair, I did have one piece I just remembered when Eddie was going through his, there was a little light bulb that went on, but it quickly went out and I forgot. In the prior tax lid of 2015, there was a brief phrase in there that said it was inflation, it was CPI, but not to go below zero. Would it be, is it your intent that if inflation does go below zero, that impacts local governments as well and they would have to actually cut their budget? Or do you want to, where we're not allowing them to exceed if inflation is high, do we want to put at least a floor on it to where if it does go below zero, we don't expect them to actually go below zero on their taxes?
Mr. Chairman, I think a floor of zero makes sense.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the late addition there, but okay, I think we're good if we want to move on to the next bill.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any other agree to disagree that we would need to?
5011. 5011, we're going to need an agree to disagree on it also.
Okay,
So do you want to go ahead and work it out and then we can come back?
sure. I think the Senate, did you, I mean, you basically offered what was in the bill. The House is willing to counter. Instead of 3%, would you consider going to 4% on the cap?
Would that be the only provision that you're changing?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, we would absolutely accept that. I know there's been some talk about the date. I want to make sure you're okay with the date. November 25. I've heard talk of changing that. I don't know.
Madam Chair, the point that you made earlier, if we delay it any longer, it does give another year for appraised values to increase. we'd be okay leaving it on the November general election.
I just wanted to double check, Mr. Chairman, we'll accept your offer at 4% then, because, yes, with the current language, just changing the 3 to a 4.
Okay.
Is that, and we will need an agree to disagree.
Okay,
There were only 10 no's, but we've got one of them in the room.
that's fine. I would like to remind the good senator, you can still sign the conference committee report and vote against it, but that, completely understand that. Would be happy to concur and get that moving.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. $5011, $2125, what would you like to look at next?
Madam Chair, I'd really like to take a look at Senate Bill 269, which is the income tax trigger. If you'll remember, we made the House offer at 15% as the only change to that.
Mr. Chairman, we're just wondering if you would accept 10%. Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
you have been amazing to deal with. We don't want to push you on this. We're going to accept your 15%.
Okay. I was
gonna
going to say, I could
push
go back to
back, but-
18% if we wanted to negotiate.
I know, you said in the interest of time, I appreciate that. But we understand the difficulty in this. And again, like we talked, there's always next year, so.
Certainly, if we need to make further adjustments, we've got the structure in place, and we can adjust rates and numbers as we see fit in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've, yeah, do you want to go over the provisions, Eddie, in 2318?
Yeah, sure. Sure, the agreement, and this would be in 269, would be to incorporate HB 2318 as passed by the House, which is the income and privilege tax rate reduction formulas based upon only SGF income and privilege tax receipts. It would, I believe, have a 4% rate floor and the corresponding privilege tax rate floors, and then also would have a 15% budget stabilization fund requirement. So the only difference relative to the House version would be that 15% as opposed to 20% on the budget stabilization fund.
Mr. Chairman, we're going to need an agree to disagree on this one also.
Okay. Unless there's any discussion on any further changes, we can go ahead and concur on this, and then we can do the agree to disagree tomorrow.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess we'll do another easy one, 2275.
Yes, that's next on my list as well.
Okay, wonderful. I think we might have a signature on this one.
Excellent. So currently we have all of the local sales tax authorities, the sales tax apportionment out of 2377, and did we put Senate Bill 33 into this one as well? I was trying to remember if we'd officially agreed on that or where we wanted to put that.
We had not agreed, but if you were comfortable with that, you were still investigating whether the onus would be on the owner or the customer. I think it's on the customer. But yes, that would be wonderful if you want to put Senate Bill 33 in there.
I'd be okay with that. I think, again, kind of like the, like that October 1st deadline concern that I have, where we specifically say in statute that the burden is on the customer to prove that, not the retailer. That was my main concern, and if we've got that spelled out, I feel like I'd be comfortable with that.
Great. So I have Finney County, Pawnee County, Seward County, and Senate Bill 33, the meat sales tax form. Is there any other provisions that were?
The Jackson County,
Jackson County, I always,
well.
yes, we did not have that bill. It came to us late, and so we did not get a chance to look at that. What were the provisions in there? Was it, what percent were they asking for?
I might turn to Adam if he remembers. I think it was 0.25% for the hospital. House Bill 2390 was the bill.
We're okay with that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I might see if Adam was I correct in that?
Yeah, he's claiming that it was 0.25% for hospital services.
Mr. Chairman, we did talk about the provisions in SB 10, but I'm not sure what we want to do with that.
We do still have a few other shells. I mean, we've got, I shouldn't call them shells, they're actually bills right now. Do we want to continue working tonight, or are some of these provisions things that we could maybe try to take a look at in the coming days? I think we've got the big ones tackled here that.
I'm afraid we might lose them if we don't finish tonight. But
Okay.
that's just, I think we're so close, Mr. Chairman. If we could take a real quick look, if we can't figure it out, then we can go ahead and break.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move forward and see where we could land. Where would you like to put Senate Bill 10 provisions?
So since it is property tax, I don't know, do you want to put it in 2125? Would you be comfortable with that?
Madam Chair, was it your intention from our discussion earlier to take the House position on that? Okay. I think we could probably put that into 2125, or are we getting, is that an additional bill that is now exceeding the?
Yeah, we're pretty confident that that doesn't pose a bundling rule challenge.
Okay, that was my count too. I wanted to double check, so.
So that would be great if we could put the House version of SB 10 in 2125.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think we're close. The only one that we have left, I know we've discussed others, but the hour's late. They're still in play for next year. So the only one we would look at is 2231, and I know you had mentioned 2096 with that, or possibly, I don't know what you want to take a look at there, but we would ask that you would consider 2231.
Okay, yeah, I think our conversation here, our biggest priority on the House side would probably be 2336, single factor apportionment. As I said, I'm fully aware that we got that to you as the clock was running out. So it would be at your discretion what you wanted to do with that bill. But that is probably the House's top priority from what we have left.
So I appreciate that, and my understanding that it wouldn't even be implemented next year, that is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The implementation date is 2027.
So Mr. Chairman, I would appreciate, I was talking to one of the tax committee members today, and I said, yeah, single apportionment, and they looked at me with deer in the headlights. Over 50% of our committee is new, and that is a term that I bet a majority of them, if not all have not heard. So I would love to move on it, but I wouldn't feel comfortable at this time asking my colleagues to take a vote on that without a better understanding of it.
Full disclosure, I was 2 years into being tax chair before I understood what three-factor and single-factor is. But Representative Sawyer.
The only thing, Madam Chair, is the important thing is that let businesses know it's coming, because there are some businesses that are going to be hurt by this, so they can make their adjustments and prepare.
So we appreciate that, and what we'd like to do is an interim committee so that we can queue that up in January, the first thing. We're not saying no, we're just saying we need to understand it before we take the vote.
It's after 9 o'clock. Do we want to, I think we'd probably prefer if we could come back again tomorrow. We've got to do some agree to disagree, so we will be back together fairly early. I know we've put in a load of work today, and I want to thank the senators. Can't even talk anymore. Certainly want to thank our staff as well. They have put in a lot of work today, and will be putting in a lot of work tonight trying to get those conference committee reports available and ready. And thank you to everyone that's still awake out there and attentive to the business of the committee. So
I think that's wise, Mr. Chairman. We'll follow your lead. Thank you for your work, and we'll see you at 10:30 tomorrow morning.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.